Jake Palmer pushed open the glass door of the diner, water dripping from his hair, jacket, and boots, forming a small puddle at his feet. He was exactly 5 minutes late. 5 minutes. But in Riverbend Diner, 5 minutes might as well have been a crime. He barely managed a single breath before the shouting began, harsh, sharp, echoing through the clatter of silverware and the stunned silence of morning regulars who pretended not to stare. The manager's voice sliced through the air as if he'd been preparing this moment all week. "You're done, Jake. You hear me? Done. Don't bother hanging your apron. Just get out." Every head in the diner turned toward him, but no one said a word. No one even blinked. People kept their eyes on their coffee cups, their pancakes, their newspapers, anything to avoid stepping into another man's misery. And Jake, exhausted, rain-soaked, and still catching his breath from sprinting through the storm, stood frozen in place. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that someone else was watching. Someone sitting quietly in the far corner, stirring a cup of tea with slow, deliberate movements. Someone who had recognized Jake the moment he walked through the door. The same man Jake had helped the night before. An old man, with steel-gray hair and a suit wrinkled from rain. The man Jake thought he'd never see again. The manager kept barking insults, each one louder and crueler than the last, but none of them mattered, because everything, every ugly word was about to come back to haunt him. Moments from now, the old man would rise from his seat, walk toward the counter, and change the course of Jake's life in a way no one in that diner would ever forget. But to understand how all of this began, we have to go back to the night a storm tore through the Cincinnati outskirts and changed the lives of two strangers forever. The rain that night was violent, the kind that bounced off the pavement in sheets and shook gutters loose from rooftops. Lightning flashed so often it looked like the sky was taking photographs. Jake gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford tight enough to turn his knuckles white. His uniform shirt clung to him, still damp from a spilled pot of coffee during the dinner rush. The wipers squealed across the windshield, fighting a losing battle as water smothered the glass faster than they could swipe it away. It was nearly midnight. The diner had stayed open late. A surprise tour bus full of hungry tourists had shown up just as he was about to clock out. He served them with the practiced smile he'd been wearing since Sarah passed. But all the while, his mind kept drifting back to his daughter, Lila. 6 years old, smaller than her laughter suggested. Asleep by now, he hoped, curled up on the neighbor's couch with her stuffed fox tucked under her chin. He had promised her he'd be home by 9. It was almost 12. His pay this week would cover rent if he stretched it, if he skipped a few meals, if the truck didn't break down, if Lila didn't need medicine or shoes or field trip money. Life as a single father was a long chain of ifs, and every link felt ready to snap. He yawned, rubbed the grit from his eyes, and continued down the nearly empty road. Suburban houses flickered by on the right, their lights glowing warmly through the curtains. He imagined families inside, parents tucking kids into bed, dishes drying on racks, TV shows murmuring in the background. Normal, peaceful, whole. His heart ached. Just as he reached the long stretch of wooded road that led toward his neighborhood, something caught his eye, a scattering of blinking orange lights in the distance, hazard lights. He slowed instinctively. A sleek black sedan sat crooked along the shoulder, steam escaping beneath the opened hood. Rain hammered the roof of the car so violently it looked like the vehicle was dissolving into the storm. And standing beside it, an older man. Shoulders hunched, suit drenched, hair slicked flat like silver paint. He squinted at a cell phone he clearly couldn't get service on, not out here where reception always dropped to 0. Jake's foot pressed the brake. His mind screamed all the logical things. Keep driving. You have a kid waiting. It's dangerous. You don't know him. But logic never stood a chance against empathy, not after what happened to Sarah. Not after he'd spent 2 years wishing someone had been with her when her car went off that icy road. Sometimes he wondered if she had died alone, calling for help that never came. He could never ignore a stranded driver. Not ever. Jake eased the truck to the shoulder and rolled the window down halfway. A blast of cold rain and engine smoke swept in. "You okay there, sir?" The man startled, then turned toward him with an expression full of equal parts relief and exhaustion. "My car died," he said, raising his voice over the storm. "Battery's shot. Engine too. Can't reach a tow. No one's answering." He looked up the road. No cars for miles. Nothing but rain, trees, and black sky. "Where are you headed?" "Home," he said with a shaky laugh. "If I can get there before I melt." Jake smiled faintly and unlocked the passenger door. "Get in. We'll figure it out from there." The man hesitated. A stranger's track on a deserted road was a gamble, but lightning cracked overhead and the rain intensified, punching the ground in furious bursts. He climbed in. The cab instantly filled with the smell of wet wool and old cologne. "Thank you," he said, his voice lower now. "You didn't have to stop." Jake put the truck in gear. "Would have felt worse if I didn't." The man studied him for a moment, his eyes sharp despite his frail appearance. "You look tired." Jake gave a half shrug. "Comes with the job." They drove in silence, the storm battering the windows like it wanted in. After a minute, the old man spoke again. "What's your name, son?" "Jake. Jake Palmer." Edward Hastings," the man replied. Jake glanced sideways. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. "Rough night for car trouble," Jake said softly. "Rough night for everything, it seems." The man's voice had a heaviness to it, not just from the rain or the cold, but from something deeper. Regret? Loneliness? Jake wasn't sure. They reached the nearest lit intersection just 10 minutes later, but the man didn't direct Jake toward some grand neighborhood or fancy estate like Jake half expected. Instead, he gestured toward a modest row of older brick townhomes, the kind middle-class families had lived in for decades. "Right there," Edward said quietly. Jake parked. Edward didn't move for a moment. Instead, he turned toward Jake with a sincerity that felt almost out of place in the midnight storm. "Most people wouldn't have stopped." "I'm not most people," Jake replied simply. Edward's lips lifted into a tired, grateful smile. "If there's ever anything I can do for you, Jake, anything at all, you come find me." Jake chuckled softly. "Just get home safe." He watched the old man climb out, wave once, and disappear under the archway of his building. Jake drove off, thinking the night was over, thinking the kindness was done. But kindness has a way of echoing. And by the next morning, in the middle of Riverbend Diner, in front of shouting managers and stunned customers, Jake would learn that one good deed, one rainy night decision, was about to change everything. Because Edward Hastings wasn't just an old man in a broken-down car. He was something else entirely. And he had not forgotten the man who stopped for him in the storm.
Jake Palmer woke up to the sound of coughing, not the gentle morning cough of a groggy kid. This was the crackling, congested kind, the kind that made a father's stomach drop instantly. "Lila," he whispered, sitting up so fast he felt dizzy. His 6-year-old daughter was curled up in her princess blanket beside him, her tiny shoulders trembling with each ragged breath. Her hair stuck to her forehead, damp with sweat. Jake touched her cheek. A fever, not sky-high, but climbing. "Sweetheart," he murmured gently. "Why didn't you wake me?" She sniffled. "You were tired, and you worked late. I didn't want to bother you." And just like that, his heart cracked in a place it still didn't know how to heal. He brushed her hair back. No, no, baby. You always wake me. Okay? Always. She nodded, eyes watery. Jake glanced at the clock, 5:42 a.m. He had to be at the diner by 6:30. His truck needed gas, and today was inventory day. The one day the manager swore he'd fire anyone who showed up late. He grabbed the thermometer, 999, not dangerous, but not good. He hurried to the kitchen. The apartment was tiny, the kind where taking 3 steps meant. You'd already reached the stove. He opened the fridge. 3 eggs, half, a carton of milk. No juice, 2 slices of bread. He sighed. Okay, he whispered to himself. We can work. With this, he cracked 1 egg for Leela, saving the other 2 for dinner. Toasted the bread. Mixed honey with warm water, the way Sarah used to do when they were young parents, just figuring things out. When he took the tray back to the bedroom, Leela was sitting up waiting for him, blanket around her shoulders like a cape. She smiled weakly. You made the honey water. Of course I did. He kissed the top of her head. Drink slow. She sipped. Jake changed into his uniform. Black slacks, white shirt, apron stuffed into his duffel. He checked his wallet. $3, some change. Not enough for gas. He'd have to pray the truck cooperated, he called their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Haverty, who had watched Leela since Sarah's death. She answered with a sleepy groan. Oh, honey. Of course I'll check on her. I'll come over in an hour. Thank you, Jake whispered, meaning it with his entire soul. He kissed his daughter again, promising he'd come home early. She nodded and whispered something so soft he almost missed it. Daddy. Yeah, baby. Don't let your boss yell at you today, he forced a smile. I'll try. But her words sat in his chest like a stone. The truck started on the second try, engine coughing like an old smoker. The rain had returned thinner than last night, but constant enough to soak anyone in minutes. Jake drummed his fingers on the steering wheel as he drove, his mind running through the long list of things he needed to do. Get medicine for Lila, pay rent in for days, fix the truck's brakes, buy groceries, maybe find a better job. Someday, but for now, he just needed to get through today. The diner came into view, Riverbend Diner, 1950s themed chrome, and building that smelled like bacon grease and burnt coffee even from the parking lot through the giant windows. He saw customers already. Seated, he checked the time. 6:3, 5 minutes late. His stomach tightened. He jogged through the rain and pushed. Open the door! Every pair of eyes turned toward him. The manager's stand stood behind the counter, arms crossed. So tightly the veins in his forehead bulged. He was the kind of boss who thought a little power meant he deserved a throne. Jake opened his mouth. Stan, I save it. The word cracked like a whip through the diner. You're late again. I know, my daughter. Oh, here we go. Stan rolled his eyes dramatically. The excuses. I swear, Jake, you must collect them like baseball cards. A few customers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Jake swallowed hard. I'm really sorry. She woke up sick. I don't care. The diner fell silent. All I care about, Stan continued loudly, making sure every customer heard him, is that my employees show up on time. You want special treatment? Go work somewhere else. Jake felt heat rising in his chest, anger and humiliation tightening his throat. Stan, tried again, voice shaking. I've never once asked for special treatment. Just a little understanding? Understanding? Stan barked. Out a laugh, you think this is therapy? You think anyone here gives a damn about your sad little single dad routine? Someone gasped softly. Jake's breath caught. Stan leaned across the counter, his face inches from Jake's. You're fired. The words hit like a punch. Jake blinked. What? But you heard me. Fired. Get out. Jake's chest tightened painfully. Need this job? I'll work extra hours. I'll know. Stan smirked. We're done. Jake's hand shook, his vision blurred. He wasn't crying. Not yet, but something inside him cracked. Dangerously. Behind him, a chair scraped softly. Edward Jake didn't see him stand. Didn't see the cane he leaned on. Didn't see the look in his eyes. But he heard the small tap of wood against the floor. A quiet declaration, a shift in the air, a warning no one recognized yet. Jake turned back to Stan, voice hoarse, broken, trembling with desperation. "Please don't do this. I have a daughter. She's sick. I'll lose our apartment." But Stan sneered. "Her problem, not mine." At that moment, Edward's cane tapped the floor again once, twice, slow, steady, as if announcing the beginning of something that could not be undone. Jake didn't know it yet. Stan didn't know it yet. No one in that diner had the faintest clue. But everything was about to change. Edward Whitford, the man Jake had saved last night, was about to speak, and when he did, the world inside Riverbend Diner would flip upside down forever. For a long, fragile moment, Jake didn't hear anything except the roaring in his ears. 5 minutes late fired, humiliated in front of a dozen strangers. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he thought of Lila sleeping with flushed cheeks, whispering, "Don't let your boss yell at you today." He thought of the rent notice taped to the fridge, the empty gas tank, the medicines he still hadn't bought. Stan's voice continued, sharp and smug, slicing clean through his spiraling thoughts. "I've been wanting to replace you for weeks. Jake, you should actually thank me. Maybe you'll find something else you're not terrible at." A few customers shifted uncomfortably. A woman at a booth lowered her fork, frowning. But no one spoke. No one challenged the manager. It was the kind of silence adults had learned to obey, the kind that said, "Don't get involved. It's not your business." Jake felt shame burning hotter than anger. He inhaled shakily. "Stan," he tried again, "please, give me one more chance." Stan tapped the counter with one finger, pretending to think. Then he smiled, slow and poisonous. "No." Jake's chest caved. He nodded once, jaw tight, voice barely a whisper. "Okay." He turned toward the door, throat closing in defeat. That was when he heard the cane. "Hey." Single tap. Not loud, not aggressive, but sharp enough to slice through every other sound in the diner. Stan stopped talking mid-sentence. A few customers glanced toward the corner booth. Edward Whitford rose slowly from his seat, using the back of the booth for support as he straightened his shoulders. Rainwater from his coat dripped onto the floor, his silver hair still slightly damp from the storm the night before. Glimmered under the neon diner lights. He wasn't dressed like the other customers. His suit was tailored. His shoes were handmade. Leather, and the cane, mahogany, with an engraved silver handle, looked like it belonged inside a museum, not a small-town diner. Jake blinked. Unsure if his exhausted brain was playing tricks on him, the old man he had helped the night before was right there. Edward took one slow step forward, leaning heavily on the cane. Tap, tap, tap. Every eye in the diner followed him. He reached the counter, facing Stan with an expression of polite, dangerous calm, the kind that came from a lifetime of not being told no. But Stan didn't recognize the threat. Not yet. He crossed his arms, annoyed. "Double quotes, sir. If you need something, you'll have to wait. I'm dealing with an employee issue." Edward's brows lifted almost imperceptibly. "Oh, I saw," he said. The voice was soft, but carried the authority of a man used to rooms falling quiet when he entered them. Stan forced a tight smile. "I'm sorry you had to witness that. You know how employees can be these days, unreliable, dramatic. You're firing him?" Edward interrupted calmly because he was 5 minutes late. Stan scoffed. "No, I'm firing him because he's always late." "That is not what you said," Edward replied gently. "And it is not what happened." A few customers glanced at each other, now clearly invested. Stan huffed. "Sir, with all due respect, this is my diner. I don't need advice on how to run it." Edward nodded slowly. "No," he agreed. "You need help." Stan's jaw clenched. "Excuse me." Edward shifted his weight on the cane and turned slightly toward Jake. "Son, would you mind telling me what happened this morning?" Jake opened his mouth, but the words shrank in his throat. He looked down. Edward stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Jake could hear. "You helped a stranger last night without asking for anything? Don't let this man take your dignity today." Jake closed his eyes, steadying himself. he exhaled. I was late because my daughter woke up with a fever, he said, voice quiet but clear enough for the nearest tables to hear. I just needed 5 minutes of understanding, that's all. Stan snorted. You see, excuses? Edward's head turned toward the manager, slowly, deliberately. His polite smile didn't reach his eyes. Tell me, Mr. Stan Green, he snapped. Mr. Green, Edward said, are you aware that this young man saved my life less than 12 hours ago? The entire diner fell into a heavy, absolute silence. Even the coffee machine seemed to stop humming. Stan blinked. Saved. Your life? Edward nodded. My car broke down in last night's storm. I was stranded. No phone signal, soaked, shivering. I would not have made it home without Jake here. A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. Stan swallowed, trying. To recover? Well, that's unfortunate, sir. But it doesn't change the fact that he's not dependable. Edward leaned one hand on the counter, eyes settling on Stan with the calm patience of a man deciding whether to end someone's career with a whisper. And are you dependable, Mr. Green? Stan stiffened. What does that mean? From where I'm standing, Edward said softly, I see a manager who publicly humiliates his employees, who fires a single father in front of witnesses, who mocks a man for caring for his sick child. Stan's face reddened. Sir, I don't think you understand. No, Edward corrected gently. I understand perfectly. He slipped a hand into his coat pocket and removed a thin leather wallet. But instead of pulling out money, he slid out a plain white card. Jake caught a glimpse of it. A gold-embossed crest. A name, Edward Whitford. A company, Whitford Holdings. Jake felt his stomach lurch. He knew that name. Everyone knew that name. Edward tapped the card softly on the counter. Mr. Green, he said. Do you know who I am? Stan suddenly looked pale. The answer was obvious now. Painfully obvious, Stan stammered. You're Edward Whitford, the CEO. God, Edward's smile widened. Very good. And because I am who I am, I'm going to offer you a choice. Stan gulped. The diner was so quiet Jake could hear rain tapping against the windows. Edward lifted the cane slightly, pointing it toward Jake. Option 1. You apologize to this man. You reinstate him. And you offer him a raise for the way you treated him. Stan blinked, flustered. A raise. Correct. Are you serious? Quite. And the second option? Stan asked shakily. Edward's polite smile vanished. His voice dropped so low, every customer leaned in just to hear. Option 2, he whispered, I buy this diner by noon. Several people gasped. Stan's mouth dropped open. You're joking. Edward didn't blink. No. Stan looked around helplessly at the customers staring at him, at the kitchen staff frozen behind the swinging doors. At Jake, who stood pale and stunned, Edward simply waited, calm, still patient, like a man who had never once in his life said something he didn't mean. Stan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Sweat trickled down his neck. Finally, he swallowed hard and turned toward Jake. He muttered, I'm sorry. His voice trembled. Jake looked at him, expression unreadable. Stan forced himself to continue. You can have your job back. With a raise. The words were painful for him to say, obvious to everyone watching, but they were, said Edward. Tapped his cane once in satisfaction. Good choice, Mr. Green. Jake stared at the scene like someone trying to process a miracle. He had no idea what to say. No idea what to feel. Edward turned to him, his stern face softening. Come, son, he said quietly. Let's have a word outside. Jake nodded slowly, following him toward the door as they stepped into the light rain. Jake finally whispered the question burning inside him. Mr. Whitford, why would you do that for me? Edward turned, eyes warm but heavy with something deeper. Because, Jake, he said softly, last night you saved much more than my life. Jake frowned. I don't understand. Edward's jaw tightened. You will, he said, but not yet. and Jake felt it. Something big was coming, bigger than he could imagine. The rain outside the diner had softened to a slow drizzle, thin enough to feel gentle, but heavy enough to pull the cold straight through Jake's clothes. Edward stopped under the overhang near the neon sign that buzzed faintly overhead, resting, both hands on his cane. For the first time since stepping out of the diner, he looked tired. Not old in the fragile sense, but old in the way men look when they've carried something heavy for far too long. Jake stood a few feet away, unsure whether he was supposed to speak first or wait. Edward made that choice for him. Me, Jake. Jake nodded, falling in step beside him as they moved toward the parking lot, puddles rippling beneath their feet. The night had dimmed to a bluish gray, the storm easing but still hanging low in the sky like a giant bruise. Edward walked slowly, his cane tapping a steady rhythm. 3 quiet taps, a pause, 3 more. The sound matched the strange heaviness in the air. So, Jake finally said, unable to ignore the knot of confusion in his chest, "Are you really going to buy the diner?" Edward chuckled under his breath. Only if Stan had chosen poorly. Thankfully for him, he didn't. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "But you would have," Jake said. Edward gave a single, deliberate nod. Without hesitation. Jake didn't understand how a person could wield so many options with such casual certainty, but Edward didn't seem arrogant. If anything, he seemed sad, like a man who had learned that money could solve problems but never fix the ones that mattered. They reached the far end of the lot where Edward's black sedan sat. Someone from the diner had recognized him and quietly arranged to have it towed and repaired earlier in the morning. The engine hummed softly in idle warm air, fogging the edges of the windows. Edward leaned against the hood to rest, breathing evenly but slowly. Jake watched him with growing concern. "You all right, sir?" Edward lifted a hand. "I'm fine, just getting old." "You don't look old," Jake said honestly. Edward gave him a thin smile. Age isn't always measured in years. The rain ticked gently against the metal beside them, the diner behind them glowing softly like a lighthouse in a storm. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Edward looked at Jake in a way that made Jake's stomach tighten. "There is something I need to tell you," Edward said. Jake straightened. "Okay. It has to do with why I was on that road last night. Why I was alone. Why my phone was off. Why no one knew where I was." Jake felt the air shift. Edward's eyes softened with something dangerously close to guilt. "I was going to see my son," he said quietly, "to fix something, to apologize." Jake's breath caught. Edward had never mentioned a family before, had never hinted at a personal reason for being out there in the storm. "I didn't make it," Edward added, staring at the rain-soaked pavement. "The argument between us had lasted too many years. I thought I had time. I thought I could wait a little longer." His throat tightened. "I was wrong." Jake swallowed hard. "Mr. Whitford." Edward shook his head. "Call me Edward." Nodded slowly. Edward took a long, shaky breaths, if the next words carried decades of pain behind them. "My son died 2 days ago." Jake went still. The world seemed to freeze for a few moments. The rain, the faint rumble of a passing car, the flickering neon lights, everything suspended in the shock of that admission. "I'm so sorry," Jake said, voice low, sincere. I can't imagine what that feels like." Edward gave a small, grateful nod. "He was about your age," Edward continued, each word costing him something. 32, a father of 2 little boys, and I was not a good father to him. I was successful, respected, powerful, but being all of those things cost me the one thing that mattered most." Jake felt something twist in his chest. Pain. Recognized pain. "I spent so long believing I could fix it later," Edward whispered. "That there would always be a next weekend, a call tomorrow, visit soon. But life doesn't negotiate with excuses." He closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. "It takes what it takes." Jake found himself leaning against the car as well, needing the support. He didn't know what to say, didn't know what could ease grief that deep. But Edward continued. his voice steadier now. After the hospital. After seeing him, I drove, and I didn't care where. I didn't care how bad the weather was. I just needed to keep moving. And then my car broke down. Okay. And there I was. An old man in the rain with no one to call, no one to help, and truthfully, I didn't expect anyone to stop. He looked at Jake, really looked at him, but you did. Jake blinked. He hadn't expected the moment to feel this heavy. You didn't know me. You had no reason to take the risk. You didn't even hesitate. Edward shook his head slowly, wonderingly. I've spent a lifetime around people who only help when they can gain something, and then use someone with very little to spare for it. More kindness in one night than most people do in decades. Jake looked at the wet pavement, throat tightening. I just did what anyone should do. Edward smiled sadly. No, son. Not anyone. If the world were full of men like you, I would never have lost my son. Jake's breath caught it, the rawness of the words. Edward straightened slightly, wiping the corner of his eye with his sleeve before the tear could fall. But that's not the only reason I stepped in today. Jake frowned. There's something else you need to know, Edward said, voice dropping. Jake tensed. What is it? You remind me of him? Edward said quietly. My son, his stubbornness, his temper, his humor, his ability to love more than he earned. He paused, gathering himself. And he also died trying to get to his child during a storm. Jake felt the ground tilt under him. Edward saw the shock in Jake's face and gently squeezed his shoulder. He was a damn good father, Edward whispered. Just like you. Jake looked away, blinking hard against the sting in his eyes. But because of me, Edward went on, he died with something unresolved between us. Something I can never fix. Jake felt Edward's grip tighten. But you, Jake, you still have time. You still have your daughter. You deserve the chance to give her the life a good father can. The rain thickened briefly, tapping faster against the car roof. Jake cleared his throat. So, what are you saying? Edward gave him a steady look. I'm saying I didn't just step in to help you. I stepped in because last night made me realize something. He paused. You didn't just save me on that road, Jake. You saved me from disappearing into grief. You reminded me that kindness still exists, unearned and unbought. He inhaled deeply. And I am not going to let a man with your heart get crushed by someone like Stan Green. Not after everything you've been through. Not after. What you gave me when you didn't even know my name. Shh. Jake had to look away again, overwhelmed. Edward continued softly. You deserved protection this morning. You deserved dignity. And if I have any say in it, he placed a hand over his chest. You deserve a future that isn't defined by fear of the next bill or the next emergency. Jake stared at him, breath shallow. Mr. Witt, Edward, he corrected. What are you planning? Cahort smiled. Something simple, he said. Something that will change everything. Out. Jake's pulse quickened. What? Open the passenger door for him. Get in the car, son. There's something you need to see. Jake hesitated only a second before sliding into the seat. Edward circled around to the driver's side, settled in, and pulled the door shut. The rain softened to a hush around them. Then Edward said, This is where your life takes a turn. And Jake felt it, the beginning of something enormous, a shift he could feel in his bones, something bigger than a job, bigger than a storm, bigger than either of them understood yet. The first 10 minutes of the drive were silent, not uncomfortable, not tense, just thick with the weight of everything Edward had revealed and everything Jake didn't yet understand. The city lights flashed across the windshield and blurred streaks as the rain tapered off, leaving the world glistening and quiet. Jake kept his hands clasped in his lap, staring at the passing neighborhoods, each one wealthier than the last. His heartbeat thudded with a rhythm that didn't match the hum of the engine. He didn't know where they were going. He didn't know why Edward looked calmer than he had since the night Jake found him, and he didn't know how one morning, one awful, humiliating, life-altering morning, had somehow turned into this. Edward finally broke the silence. Do you know what most people see when they look at you? He asked without taking his eyes off the road. Jake blinked. I don't know. A struggling single dad, probably. A good man, Edward corrected quietly. A man who keeps pushing even when he has nothing left. A man who shows up for his child. A man who helps strangers in the rain. Jake stiffened. Compliments always felt like clothes tailored for someone else. Good men, real men, strong men. He never quite believed he belonged among them. I've been called a lot of things, Jake said, rubbing the back of his neck. A good man wasn't usually on the list. Edward let out a soft breath, something between sadness and understanding. That's because the people who said those things never took the time to see you. The words hung in the air. Jake didn't respond because he didn't know how. The GPS screen glowed softly as Edward made a turn into a gated property. The guard in the booth straightened immediately, eyes widening, and lifted the gate without a word. "Mr. Whitford," he muttered with reverence. Jake's brow furrowed. Whitford, the surname, hadn't registered till that moment. He looked sharply at Edward. "You're that Whitford?" Edward gave a tired smile. "I suppose there aren't many of us." Jake wasn't up on billionaire lists or corporate news, but even he recognized the name. Whitford Manufacturing, Whitford Energy, Whitford Logistics. Entire factories, supply chains, and product lines employed tens of thousands of Americans, and the man he helped on the side of the road is the one who built it. His throat went dry, sir. "I didn't know. I had no idea." Edward waved a hand. "Good. I prefer it that way." The car rolled forward. Jake had expected a mansion, marble pillars, fountains, stone statues, all the luxury he'd never touched, except in magazines. But Edward's house was nothing like that. It was large, yes, sizzly, 6,000 or 7,000 square feet, but it was warm, wood and brick, soft lights glowing through tall windows, wraparound porch. A home built not for showing off, but for living. Edward parked outside the garage and turned off the engine. He didn't move for several seconds, just looked at the house. "I bought this place when my son was 5, he said quietly. He used to climb that oak tree in the back, broke his arm on it once. He let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, never stopped him from climbing again. Jake lowered his eyes. Loss had a way of pressing into a person's chest. Even when it wasn't their own. Edward finally opened the door. "Come, there's something I want to give you." Jake followed him up the steps and through the front door. The inside was warm and softly lit by amber lamps, the air smelling faintly of cedar. Pictures lined the hallway, family photos, old vacation snaps, birthdays, graduations. Edward's son was in many of them, tall, brown-haired, smiling with 2 little boys clinging to his legs. Jake slowed at one photo, Edward. Younger and sturdier, holding a toddler who couldn't be older than 3. They were laughing. Both faces turned toward someone behind the camera. Edward noticed. "He was a good kid," said, his voice gentle. "He deserved a better father." Jake swallowed. "Hard. You did what you could, sir." Edward shook his head. "No, I did what I thought mattered. And that's not the same." They walked further into the house, and then Jake noticed the stack of files sitting, neatly arranged on the dining room table. Folders, contracts, a laptop, a fountain pen, a phone sitting face down beside everything. Edward gestured for Jake, too. "Sit." Jake hesitated. "What is all this?" Edward lowered himself slowly into the chair across from him. "I wasn't lying when I said that man back at the diner had no right to speak to you the way he did. But I also wasn't lying when I said I intend to make sure you never end up in that kind of situation again." Jake frowned slightly. "I'm not sure I understand." Edward leaned forward, hands clasped. "Jake, this is an offer." Jake's heartbeat kicked up. "You have 2 choices," Edward continued. "You can continue working jobs that barely pay your bills, scraping by, praying the car starts, praying your daughter doesn't get sick, praying nothing unexpected happens." His eyes softened. "Or you can let me make sure you and Lydia never have to live like that again." Jake stiffened. "I'm not taking handouts," he said immediately, almost instinctively. "I appreciate what you did back there. I do. But I'm not some charity case. Edward's lips twitched, amused, sad, respectful all at once. That's exactly why I'm here talking to you. Because you're not the kind of man who expects anything from anyone. Jake folded his arms across his chest. Then, what is this? Edward tapped the top file. A job. Jake blinked. A job? A real one? Edward said. With benefits? A salary, stability, future, growth. Enough to take care of your daughter. Enough to breathe for the first time in years. Jake stared, muscles tense. What kind of job? Edward opened the file, sliding it toward him. My company has a logistics hub 20 minutes from here. One of the night shift supervisors retired last month. It's honest work, good pay, and from what I've observed, you're exactly the type of man the position needs. Jake stared at the paper but didn't touch it. Why me? He whispered. Edward met his eyes. Because you remind me of the kind of man my son used to be. He paused. And the kind of man I should have been. Jake's chest tightened. And because Edward added softly, you didn't save a billionaire that night. You saved a father, a grieving one, a drowning one, and you did it out of pure kindness. Jake's voice cracked. Edward. I don't know what to say. Edward gave him a small smile. Say yes. Start with that. Jake stared. Down at the job contract. Health insurance. Retirement plan. $83,000. Starting salary. More than he'd made in the last 3 years combined. A new life. A stable life. A life where fear didn't dictate every decision. And Lydia, his sweet girl. She would never have to feel the instability he grew up with. Jake closed his eyes. Then he opened them, reached for the pen, signed. His hand shook the whole time. As soon as the ink dried, his breath left him in a soft, stunned exhale. Edward smiled, truly smiled for the first time in days. Good, he whispered. Very good. Jake leaned back, heart thundering. This morning, he'd been fired tonight. It's something he hadn't felt since Sarah died. Hope. Jake barely slept that night. Even after signing the contract. Even after Edward insisted he take home a printed copy of the offer, just so it feels real. Even after he hugged Lydia so tight she giggled and told him he was squishing her ribs. His body was exhausted, but his mind. It ran like a cracked engine, sputtering between disbelief, terror, relief, a strange sense of guilt he couldn't quite name. He finally dozed off around 3 in the morning, only to wake again at 5, heart pounding, hands shaking, as though some part of him still didn't trust that. Everything wasn't just a fragile dream waiting to disappear at sunrise. He wasn't used to good news, not the kind that stayed by 7. He and Lydia were sitting at their tiny kitchen table, sunlight spilling through the blinds in soft gold stripes. Lydia swung her legs under the chair, kicking the air, humming off-key to a cartoon theme song. Jake watched her with a tenderness that felt heavier than usual. You're staring? Daddy, she said, raising an eyebrow that looked way too grown. For a 6-year-old, Jake blinked. Sorry, are you okay? He hesitated. She was young. Too young to understand the layers of all this. But she understood. Worry kids always did. Jake forced a smile and reached across the table, brushing a crumb from her cheek. I'm okay, Peanut. More than okay, actually. She studied him, serious and quiet, then her face lit up. You got a new job, right? That's why you're smiling like your face is stuck? Jake laughed, a sound that came out rusty but real, something like that. They finished breakfast, and he sent her off to school with an extra tight hug, one that made her give him a suspicious squint before skipping away. But the second, Jake stepped back inside the apartment. His phone buzzed once, twice, 5 times. In a row, he frowned and grabbed it off the counter. Unknown numbers. One local one, blocked one from the diner. A cold pit formed in his stomach. He opened the first text. You're in big trouble. Jake stared at the screen. Who? Why? The next message came instantly. Riverbend is going crazy. Call me now. It was from Casey, the cook who'd always slipped Lydia extra pancakes when the manager wasn't watching. Jake called immediately. Casey answered on the first ring. Dude, he said breathlessly, your name is everywhere. Jake felt his heartbeat thud painfully. My name? What did I do? Haven't posted anything, not you, Casey said. The old guy, that man who helped you. He's all over the news, bro. Jake froze. The old man. Edward Whitford. What about him? Jake whispered. Casey inhaled sharply. He went public. About the diner? Jake felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. What? He gave an interview. Not on TV, not yet, but online. Local reporter, big following. He talked about what happened yesterday. Jake swallowed hard. What? Exactly, did he say? That he was in the diner? Casey said. That he witnessed the manager berating you. That this town treats working-class people like trash and he's sick of it. He didn't mention your name directly, but trust. Me, everyone who was there recognized the story instantly. Jake pressed a palm to his forehead. He didn't. He did, Casey said, and that's not the best part. Jake sank into the nearest chair. What now? Manager lost it. Casey said breathlessly. Tried doing damage. Control online, accusing you of lying, saying you were lazy, saying you've been late before. Jake's jaw clenched. He knew this would happen. Some part of him always knew, and that reporter. Casey added a hint of awe in his voice. She roasted him alive, and then she posted pictures. Jake froze. What pictures? Casey paused. The ones from yesterday. Someone in the diner filmed the whole thing. The manager yelling, you apologizing. Edward standing up. The moment he told the manager he could bury that diner with one phone call. All of it. Jake's blood ran cold. Someone filmed it? Someone put it online? And now, Casey continued, lowering his voice like a man breaking sacred news, it's gone viral. Jake leaned over the table, elbows pressed into the wood, head spinning. Why now? He whispered. Why did he have to go public? Why drag this into the spotlight? Casey exhaled softly. Because he's not just some guy, Jake. He's got influence. Apparently, after what you did for him the other night, decided to use it. Jake didn't know what to say. He wished Edward had warned him. He wished he'd told him, before unleashing a storm. But at the same time, Jake understood. He had been powerless yesterday. Edward had been forced to watch someone treat him like dirt, simply because he was poor. Wet, exhausted. And 5 minutes late, Edward had the means to strike back. Jake never did. Now, everything was different. Casey said the manager was panicking, deleting posts, issuing statements, begging people to stop calling for a boycott. But it was too late. River. Ben Diner had become a symbol of cruelty, and Jake, whether he liked it or not, was now the public face of how unfairly working people were treated. Jake rubbed his temples. Casey, I can't deal with this right now. I get that, Casey said gently, but you need to hear the last part. Jake tensed. What now? The owner of the diner? The corporate owner? They're coming in today. Jake blinked. For what? To fire the manager, Casey said, immediately. No meeting. No warning. They're flying in from Chicago. Jake's breath caught. He didn't expect that. He didn't want to see anyone else lose their job, even if they deserved it. But then, Casey's voice dropped to a whisper, and, there's more. Jake braced himself. Reporters are at the diner, Casey whispered. A whole bunch. Asking for you. Asking why you haven't made a statement. I'm not making any statement, Jake said immediately. Yeah, Casey said awkwardly. Except, everyone wants one. People online are calling you the waiter who stood up to power. Hashtags everywhere. You're trending in Ohio, maybe even nationwide by now. Jake felt like the ground beneath him shifted. I didn't stand up to anyone, he muttered. I just got fired. Yeah, Casey said with a laugh. But you got fired with dignity, with compassion, with patience. The whole video shows you apologizing while that jerk yelled his face off. People eat that stuff up. Jake sank deeper into the chair, overwhelmed. This is too much. I know, Casey said softly. But think of this as the world finally giving you a break. Jake didn't know if he believed that. After the call ended, he stared at the wall for several minutes, barely breathing. He wasn't used to attention. Wasn't used to being seen. He wasn't used to anything that didn't involve juggling bills, wiping grease off tables, and trying to be both parents to a little girl who deserved better. He just wanted peace. But peace wasn't an option anymore. His phone buzzed again. This time, a message from an unknown number. "Jake, it's Edward. I need to see you today. Something important has happened." Jake stared at the words. Something important. More important than viral videos, firings, reporters, or new jobs. His stomach tightened. Whatever Edward wanted to tell him, it wasn't small, and it wasn't good. Jake stood in front of the mirror longer than he meant to, palms pressed against the chipped bathroom sink, head hanging between his shoulders. He looked tired, more than tired, hollowed out, like a man watching pieces of his life move without him, pushed by forces he didn't understand. His phone sat on the counter. Screen lit with the text from Edward. "I need to see you today. Something important has happened." Jake stared at the message again and again, but the words didn't change. Something important. His stomach clenched. Important in Edward's world wasn't the same as important in his own. Jake's emergencies involved overdue rent notices, Lydia's asthma medication, or an empty fridge before payday. Edward lived in boardrooms and skyscrapers. His important could shake whole companies. Jake splashed cold water on his face, dried it with the least worn corner of a towel, and tried to pull himself together. He had no clue what storm he was walking into, but he had to go, for Lydia, for the job he'd been offered, and for the truth. Whatever it was, he grabbed his jacket and stepped outside into crisp morning air that carried the bite of late fall. Gray clouds hovered low, making the world feel heavy and close. It matched the weight in his chest. Edward's driver, the same man from the night they met, waited by the curb. He gave Jake a polite nod as he opened the back door. "Morning, sir," he said. Jake still flinched at that word. Sir. Nobody had ever called him that before 2 days ago. The door closed. The city rolled past the windows, and Jake tried to steady his breathing as they pulled onto Riverbend Drive. "Is everything okay?" Jake finally asked, voice soft, unsure. The driver hesitated, barely, but enough for Jake to notice. "I'm not at liberty to discuss Mr. Whitford's affairs," he said, "but he's under pressure this morning." Pressure, Jake's mind spun with possibilities. Had the video affected Edward too? Had people dug into who he was? Had Jake jeopardized something without meaning to? When the car finally slowed in front of the skyscraper, Jake felt a rush of nerves so sharp it made his hands tremble. The building was enormous, a tower of glass reflecting the clouds. Its mirrored panels rippled in the wind like the surface of a lake. Employees streamed inside in suits far nicer than anything Jake had ever worn. He suddenly felt underdressed, underprepared, and completely out of place. The driver stepped out and opened the door. "He's waiting for you on the top floor." Jake stepped onto the pavement, swallowed hard, and followed. Inside, the lobby was so polished it looked like a magazine spread come to life. Marble floors, towering ceilings, gold-trimmed elevators, everything elegant, everything expensive, everything screaming a world he didn't belong in, but Edward had asked for him, so he went. The elevator ride felt endless. The numbers ticked up slower than seemed possible. When the doors finally opened, Jake stepped into a quiet corridor lined with modern art pieces he couldn't begin to interpret. A woman at a sleek desk greeted him professionally. "Mr. Whitford is in his office," she said. Go right." Jake exhaled shakily. He pushed open the glass door. Edward stood at the window, hands braced on the frame, staring down at the city as if he were trying to move it with sheer will. He didn't turn around when Jake entered. The silence stretched. For several seconds before Edward finally spoke, "You went viral," he said quietly. Jake winced. "I saw." Edward turned then, slowly, and Jake's heart jolted. Edward looked nothing like the calm, warm man who had sat in the diner. His face was hard-drawn, stressed in a way that made him look older than he had before. His eyes were tired. His jaw was tense. His whole posture was that of a man carrying a weight that threatened to break him. "Jake," Edward said, "I owe you an apology." Jake blinked in shock. "Sir, no." Edward lifted a hand. "Let me say it. I involved you in something without preparing you. Yesterday at the diner, the cruelty I saw, it wasn't just about you. It was the last straw for me. I've spent years watching people get stepped on by a system I built, funded, and benefited from. And when I saw you exhausted, apologizing, drenched, humiliated by someone who had no right to treat you that way, I snapped." Jake didn't know how to process that. Edward walked closer, his expression softening. "I thought exposing the incident would help. I thought shining a light on how you were treated would force people to look at the truth." He sighed heavily. "But I didn't account for what it would do to you. I'm sorry for that." Jake swallowed, voice tight. "Edward, I appreciate the support. I do. But everything is moving so fast. Reporters are outside the diner. People are messaging me non-stop. I just wanted to keep my head down, work, and take care of my daughter. Now I'm some symbol online that I never agreed to be." Edward nodded slowly. "I know. And that's why I asked you here." He gestured toward the desk. Jake walked over. That's when he saw it. A binder thick, heavy, filled to the brim. His name was on the cover. "What is this?" Jake whispered. Edward hesitated. Then he stepped closer and rested a hand on the binder. "This," he said quietly, "is everything the media has dug up about you in the last 12 hours. Jake's blood turned cold. "What do you mean?" "Everything?" Edward looked him in the eye. "They know where you live. They know where Lydia goes to school. They know about your ex. They know about the months you fell behind on rent. They know about every job you've ever worked and why you left." Jake felt physically sick. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he whispered. "No," Edward said. "It wasn't, and that's why. Things have escalated." Jake's breath stalled in his lungs. "Escalated? How?" Edward turned toward a second folder on the desk. Slimmer, cleaner, printed on embossed cream-colored paper. "This," Edward said gently, "is the actual reason I needed to see you." Jake opened the folder. His stomach dropped. Inside was a letter signed, stamped, official. It wasn't from a business. It wasn't from a company. It was from the attorney. General's office. Jake felt dizzy. He scanned the words, barely able to process them. Notice of pending investigation. Labor violations. Wrongful termination. Whistleblower protections. Whistleblower. Jake choked on a breath. "Edward, I didn't blow any whistle. I didn't file anything. I didn't need to," Edward said quietly. "The video did, because of who I am. Because of the company I built. The people I employ you're firing is being treated as a possible corporate-level violation." Jake shook his head. "I don't understand." Edward stepped closer. "My corporation owns the Riverbend Diner. Franchise," he said softly. "I didn't know, I swear, but legally I am tied to what happened to you. And because I spoke publicly, I inadvertently triggered a legal inquiry." Jake stared at him, speechless, overwhelmed, terrified. Edward's voice softened further. "They're looking into everything. Jake, the manager, the ownership, the working conditions, all of it." Jake felt the world tilt around him. "And they want me involved?" he whispered. Double quotes. "Yes," Edward said. "They want your statement. They want you to testify. They want you to be the face of the workers affected?" Jake sank into a chair, hands shaking uncontrollably. "I don't want to be the face of anything." Edward crouched in front of him, a billionaire kneeling at the feet of a broke waiter. "You have every right to walk away," he said gently. "Every right. I will support you no matter what you choose. But Jake, you need to know one more thing." Jake looked up. Edward took a breath. "The consequences of this investigation won't fall on the diner," he said. "Fall on me." Jake stared. "What?" Edward straightened slowly, eyes filled with something Jake had never seen before. Fear. They want to make an example, Edward whispered, of the franchise owner, the top of the chain. Me. Felt his heart drop. His voice cracked. Edward. Why didn't you tell me? Edward lowered his gaze. Because I didn't want you to feel responsible. You've carried enough burdens in your life. You shouldn't have to carry mine. Jake's throat tightened painfully. He had no family, no partner, nobody who had ever protected him. But Edward, a man with more power than most countries, had shielded him instinctively. Jake's voice was barely audible. What do you want me to do? Edward looked at him with quiet, raw vulnerability. I want you to decide whether you stand with me or step away before this gets worse. Jake's pulse hammered. Because this moment, this choice would change everything for both of them. Jake didn't sleep that night. He lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling while Lydia slept peacefully in her room, unaware that her father's entire world was hanging by a thread. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of that binder, thick with every detail of his life, burned into his mind. They knew everything, everything, and yet none of it bothered him as much as Edward's face when he said he might lose everything. Jake had never asked anyone to fight for him, but Edward had, and now the consequences were knocking on both of their doors. By morning, Jake felt hollow, but strangely steady. Something inside him had settled into place overnight. Not calm exactly, but clarity. A sense of direction in the chaos. He packed Lydia's lunch, braided her hair, and walked her to the bus stop. She hugged him extra tight before climbing. Aboard, you're squishing me, Peanut, Jake teased weakly. She giggled. You smell like coffee again. It's part of my charm. No, she corrected. It's part of your job. Jake froze. He knelt so he was a level with her. What if Daddy didn't have that job anymore? She blinked. Did you get fired again? Jake swallowed. Something like that, Lydia thought hard, then shrugged in the way only a child could. As long as you still come home, that's all I care about. The bus doors hissed shut behind her, and Jake watched it disappear down the street. He took a long, shaky breath. Then he headed toward the building where everything would be decided. The Attorney General's office was colder than he expected, not the temperature, but the atmosphere. Sanitized, sterile. Every sound seemed to echo. Every footstep felt loud. Lawyers and officials walked by with clipped voices and tightly controlled expressions. Jake sat across from a woman in a navy suit, her hands folded neatly on the table. Mr. Palmer, thank you for coming. Yeah, Jake said, forcing calm. Of course, she opened a folder. As you know, the state is pursuing an investigation into the labor violations surrounding Riverbend Diner. But due to Mr. Whitford's recent public involvement, there is additional interest in the corporate responsibility aspect.
Ouch.
Jake sighed. I'm not sure I understand why that part matters. She cut him off gently. It matters because Edward Whitford isn't just a franchise owner. He has political influence, lobbying connections. And when someone like him enters the public conversation about labor mistreatment, it raises questions. Jake's jaw tightened. So this is political. Everything at this level is political. Jake exhaled slowly. She continued, we need your testimony. Not just about the night you were fired, but about any patterns of mistreatment you witnessed. Jake's brow furrowed. Patterns. I wasn't abused for years. My manager was just a jerk. That's what starts patterns, she said sharply. And if the organization enabling him goes unchecked, the damage spreads. Jake ran a hand through his hair. So you're building a case against Edward? No, she said firmly. Against the system? Edward is a symbol. Jake almost laughed. Of what? Old money? Power? Billionaire guilt? He's a symbol of accountability, she corrected. If he cooperates, we make progress. He doesn't, he becomes the sacrifice. Jake's heart hammered. And where do I stand? She looked him dead in the eyes. You are the hinge. The one person who can tip the scale either way. Jake's breath caught. He was just a waiter. Just a single dad trying to survive. But now he was the hinge. The weight of those words pressed Down on him, Mr. Palmer, she continued. Do you feel Edward Whitford manipulated you, coerced you, used your story for personal gain? No, Jake said immediately. He helped me, protected me. Did he protect you or protect himself? Jake froze. Memories flashed through his mind. Edward standing in the rain, Edward offering him a coat, Edward stepping in at the diner, Edward kneeling in front of him, a billionaire in a suit saying, "You shouldn't have to carry my burdens." Jake clenched his jaw. He protected me, Jake said quietly. The woman studied him carefully. Very well. We'll ask you to repeat that under oath. 2 hours later, Jake walked out of the office. Feeling like he'd been hollowed out and filled with lead, he pulled out his phone. A message from Edward waited. Are you all right? Jake stared at the screen. Then he typed back, We need to talk. Face to face, Edward responded instantly. Come up. Floor, when Jake entered the office, Edward was pacing, shoulders tight, phone in hand, jaw locked. You spoke with them? Edward asked. Jake nodded. Edward exhaled sharply, looking out the window. They want blood, he muttered. They always do. Jake approached him slowly. Edward, what aren't you telling me? Edward closed his eyes, just for a second, as if deciding whether to reveal something he'd kept hidden for years. Then he turned. There's a reason the state sees me as a symbol, he said quietly. A reason they're circling. Jake waited. When my father built this company, Edward said, he built it fast. Recklessly. He made promises, cut corners, buried mistakes. I've spent the last 20 years trying to clean up what he left behind. Jake's brow furrowed. What does that have to do with the diner? Everything, Edward said. Riverbend Diner was one of his early acquisitions. A small chain he bought cheap. He never upgraded the systems, modernized the policies, never fixed the structure. So the violations were inherited, Edward finished softly. And because I'm his son, I inherited the liability. Jake absorbed that. So they think punishing you punishes him? Edward nodded once. And because the public loves a fallen titan, they'll drag me through the mud until someone feels satisfied. Jake felt anger rising, surprising and sharp. You didn't do this? No, Edward said. But I didn't fix it fast enough either. That makes me responsible. Jake's hands curled into fists. This man, the same one people online called a fraud, a manipulator, a savior, villain depending on the post, had been trying to right someone else's wrongs for decades, and now the government wanted to sacrifice him because it made good headlines. Edward, Jake said quietly. I won't let them destroy you for something you didn't do. Edward blinked, stunned. Jake, you owe me nothing. You're wrong, Jake said. Oh. You honesty. And the truth is, you're the only person who's fought for me in years. So I'm fighting for you. Edward swallowed hard. A long silence stretched between them. Then Edward whispered, What did you tell them? Told them you protected me, that you didn't manipulate me, that you didn't use me. Edward's eyes softened with a gratitude, so profound it nearly buckled his composure. Jake, he said, voice low. You may have just changed the entire direction of their case. Jake stepped closer. But you have to do your part too. Edward's brows lifted. What part is that? Jake took a steady breath. You have to show them you're not your father, not the man they think you are. You have to stand up and fight. Publicly with me, not above me, beside me. Edward breathed in slowly. Then he nodded. Then that's what we'll do. 2 days later, the press conference filled the plaza in front of the Attorney General's building. Cameras swarmed. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder. News vans lined the streets. Jake stood behind the podium, heart pounding so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. Edward stood beside him, not in front, not away, but beside. Jake looked out at the cameras, and then he spoke. Not with fear, not with shame, but with the voice of a man who had finally found himself. And when he finished, he stepped back. Edward stepped forward, and in that moment, as the billionaire faced the nation with a humility that stunned the reporters into silence, The world shifted. Not because a powerful man spoke, but because he didn't speak alone. Hours later, after the crowd had dispersed, after the questions had ended, after the tension finally eased, Edward walked beside Jake through the quiet plaza. "You didn't have to do any of this," Edward said softly. "I know," Jake replied. "Then, why?" Jake looked at him, truly looked at the man he had met on a rainy road in the middle of nowhere. "Because people helped me once," Jake said, "and I never forgot it. You helped me, now I help you. That's how it should work." Edward nodded, his expression warm, grateful. "And now?" he asked. "What happens next?" Jake smiled faintly. "We rebuild," he said. Together, and for the first time in a long time, maybe the first time in years, Jake Palmer felt steady, hopeful, whole. A single act of kindness had built a bridge between two very different worlds, and now, standing on that bridge, neither man was alone.